Great. I only need the notes for this part to make sure I get your title right. Okay, I think we're going to begin. We may have some guests who arrive late, traffic in Atlanta. But I want to thank you all for coming tonight for this conversation with Heather Pesanti, who is the Chief Curator and Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Contemporary Austin, and a colleague whom I've respected and admired for so long, and plus which is someone who I love. I really think of you fondly, even though we never see each other practically every 5 years.
Me too, yeah.
And it's like a small group of people, right, that I think, for me, among our curatorial colleagues in the U.S. anyway, a few people come to mind, Franklin Sermons at the Perez, you, Michelle White at the Manil, anyway.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Same way.
well, thank you for coming and being here. Heather has been asked by Artadia to come to Atlanta to visit with some artists in our city, which is a wonderful thing for our artist community in the city because, there are curators in Atlanta, myself included, obviously. But what's really important is for our artists who live and work in Atlanta to have the perspective and input of brilliant curators like Heather, and have the opportunity to show their work and get the kind of feedback that's critical in their development as artists. So thanks to Artadia for continuing this critical program that's so important around the country in different cities. But also thank you for your willingness to meet with some of our great artists here in Atlanta. So.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I think Artadia's impulse and mission is a really great one. Actually, the slide that's up, it reminded me when you're giving your intro of a mentor of mine, Rob Storr, who is actually a friend and colleague of Michael's, who wrote for your Al Taylor book and is writing for my upcoming catalog, but was my professor at the when I went to graduate school for curating. Who was helping me out when I had my first curatorial gig at the MCA Chicago, which we both share roots in the MCA. But I remember I told him, I've been tasked with curating this 12 by 12, which is, as a curator now, it's really not a scary proposition. But back then it was terrifying. And I was so worried about visiting artists and what do they expect of me and what can I offer them? Because let's say I can only do 1 or 2 shows, I'm going to visit a whole bunch of people. And Rob said, the looking is a privilege. The artist and you both should feel that it's a privilege. It's a privilege for an artist to have people truly look, just open their eyes and look, and that could be any one of you. Because I think as an artist, you sometimes feel like it's a tree falling in the woods and nobody's hearing it. And so that really empowered me to kind of go out on, I think I made 60-something studio visits for this 1 or 2 shows that happened. And I will say that somebody said to me when I was trying to make all these visits, they said, I don't know why you're doing this, because if they're a good artist, we already know about them. And I thought, I'm young and new, but I'm pretty sure that's not true.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And it's so, the 12 by 12 program is something that I was involved with too during my years at the MCA. I left just a few years before you joined the MCA as you were the Sussman Fellow?
Yes.
Curatorial Fellow?
Yes.
Which is a very prestigious position at the museum. And we started this program, the curatorial team at MCA, for a number of reasons, but the chief among them was to build a bridge between the museum and the artist community in the city, because that's something that over time, with the building of the new museum, fell to the wayside. And so this is one of a couple of different ways that we sought to reconcile this divide between artists who live and work there and the museum itself. And part of that for me as well was, as an assistant curator at the museum, was to go out and meet with so many artists across the city who were emerging. The program is for emerging artists, and there's so many talented, brilliant young people in the different programs, right?
Yeah, and by the time I got there, though, what I liked about it is that emerging didn't need to be age as well. Emerging could have been someone who was 60 who hadn't had much of a show or had never been recognized or tended to be young. But and the thing that struck me at that early stage in my career, though, was how fraught that program was. Because when you make the effort to reach out and to connect the museum, it's really hard to please everyone. I just remember that like it was like above my pay grade, but I remember there was all this sort of like feedback and challenges that they continued to have with it. But I thought it was fantastic. And I did make something like 60 something visits in 6 months. And then I did a presentation at the end, and a bunch of the artists who, I left, the fellowship was over, it was just in 2005, and I think several of them got shows, because you just take the time to engage and go look.
Right, and that practice of doing studio visits, which is something that as a young curator may be a little intimidating, as a fellow, me as an assistant curator, I had never really done that in a professional way, or representing an institution like I had, was something that I had to learn to do, right? Yeah. And I learned that space is, while the act of looking and discussing work was a real privilege and a joy, eventually, ultimately, that I always kept it in front of mind that the space is private space. It's a privilege for me to be there. It can be a vulnerable space for the artist, and that informed me in how I approach studio visits and how I approach meeting with artists today. I don't know, how do you prepare for studio visits?
Well, I definitely prepare for them. That's one thing, is just like doing some homework on the artist. I think it's like the least that you can do. It shouldn't be this uneven power structure where, they're obligated to reveal everything, or I think I do the usual prep. I make sure I read and I know, and I have things to talk about and questions to ask, and I think that the best studio visits obviously the dream studio visit is when you know that you can invite them to do a show. That's the dream. But the real most often studio visits are, is where you can have an open dialogue about things, and you learn things from them and they learn things from you. So
the managing expectations is really important with studio visits, right? Because you want to come and learn and contribute your input.
I'm smiling because I feel like sometimes the job of a contemporary curator is also, the subtitle is a manager of expectations. I think that's very important.
Absolutely. And as you do reach out to members of your community, there are rising expectations that contribute to this feeling of disappointment, of wanting to participate, and obviously it's not possible for everyone to participate, right? So it can be difficult.
Yeah, and it's complicated too, because I feel a lot of kinship with you on many levels, but one of them is that you're the connection in a big way with the art community, as the curator of modern and contemporary art here, and as someone who I know that you go to openings, the artists all know you that I visited on this trip and in my last trip to Atlanta. You have this connection with them, but the mission of our museums is not only about that one thing. And so all of our desires to connect with artists and to have a reciprocal exchange is also mitigated by, a bigger vision that includes that as one thing, but it is one of many things. So that can be challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a big challenge, especially in a general museum like the High Museum. It's a general museum. We have 7 departments. We're not encyclopedic by any stretch of the imagination, but um, we have 7 departments who are competing for time and resources and space, schedule. But not only through competition, it's important for our program to be integrated and to reflect the strengths and histories of our departments. And so for that reason, there are limited opportunities to do exhibitions and to make acquisitions, and we can only hope that we do make the right kinds of decisions, right? When we are able to get an exhibition on the schedule and when we're able to make an acquisition. I like when we were talking earlier today. Now I'll back up. I had asked Heather to have this kind of free-flowing conversation because we never get to do it, very rarely get to do it. And because Artadia had invited you here and asked us to get together. And Artadia, of course, is so important because it provides direct grants to artists, and that's something that the NEA stopped doing years and years ago. And there are more organizations that do that, and it's really critical and so meaningful to artists to have that kind of direct support. And for Artadia, it's specific to different cities in different regions in the U.S. And I know Heather has had this intersection with community from Chicago with 12 by 12 throughout your career, from the Carnegie in Pittsburgh. I didn't go through Heather's whole career, which is so impressive, from MCA Chicago to the Carnegie to the Albright Knox in Buffalo, and now at the Austin Contemporary, and coming from a background, an academic background in anthropology at Oxford University. I mean, you're such a big brain. So.
Well, actually, so he's bringing this up because one of the slides I have is I'm doing a show finally on the intersection of art and anthropology, but I think that one of the things I maintain from my anthropology background, or maybe the 2 things that connected always, were my interest in material culture, so basically studying stuff, the stuff that people make, and I mean art is stuff, and you know, objects that anthropologists study are things too, but also field work. So I'm a big believer in putting your nose and ear to the ground and sniffing out the good ideas. So I tend to go to a place and try to do that. The images here, this was early on, this was at the Carnegie. I worked on the Carnegie International, which is a very big, the second oldest big survey biennial type show behind Venice. So it was 1865 was Venice, and late 1800s, let's just say. I can't remember exactly. And they were 6 months apart. And so while I was doing that show, I was really wanting to take a bite out of the local art community and engage with artists in Pittsburgh. And I did a couple of exhibitions, and this was one of them. This was outside of my main gig at the Mattress Factory, which had a historically kind of fraught relationship with the Carnegie. And I engaged a bunch of local artists and also cross-disciplinary. So Lori Mancuso did this really insane, amazing, mise en scène, and then David Wettergreen was a scientist at Carnegie Mellon, and he was a robotics guy and had been studying in the Atacama Desert in Chile, and he basically said yes because his mother was a painter and loved the Mattress Factory. Anyways. And took this rare footage that he had from the Atacama Desert that appeared to be going downwards when he projected it in a closet. But I brought up this slide to kind of show the interest in community and artists from the region, but also I continue to maintain an interest in cross-disciplinary, and I think it's a mistake to keep things too much in boxes. And so I think that impulse was there early on.
And your work on the Carnegie International also may have been, I don't know if that's true, the first time that the Carnegie International kind of got off campus, out of the museum, out of the big white, historic museum, into the community in a big way.
Yeah, a little bit. I can't take that much credit for that show in terms of doing community things, because I really think that we started, but then it was the ones that came after that worked really hard to integrate with the community. Like the one that came next, I remember they had like a whole year of programming before the Carnegie International. They rented a house in Lawrenceville and did all these, like, had all these artist visits. I think they did way better than we did, but it was maybe just starting when I was there, so.
Yeah, there has to be that initial sort of seeding of possibilities for an institution.
Yeah.
For an institution to find its comfort level, getting outside of its, in our case, our campus, outside of our buildings, to actually make that physical connection with community in a collaborative way, in a very open way, right? In a generous way, I think.
Yes. Yeah, and then that applies this show, and I didn't have any images. This is pre-digital, a lot of it, but we're just not as easily accessible. So, but then there was a post-industrial, Pittsburgh is a post-industrial Rust Belt town, and there was outside of Pittsburgh is a small city town called Braddock, which was the heart of the steel mining industry in Pittsburgh. And when I was in Pittsburgh, it was 85% abandoned. And when I say that, I mean you would like walk into houses and it looked like there was a flood and someone just ran out. It was like baby clothes and cribs and beds, and like it just like that's what the houses were like. And the mayor of Braddock and I became friends, and he invited me to do some art something, and he didn't know what, so I went and found a grant for $10,000, which at that time in Braddock was a lot of money, and curated a show of artists from Pittsburgh and Braddock in a schoolhouse, an abandoned schoolhouse that is now like a bona fide nonprofit art space. So that was cool. And fun.
Super cool. I know,
Yeah.
to be part of that legacy of
Yeah.
establishing not-for-profit spaces, alternative spaces in cities through this work, through this curiosity and willingness to engage, right?
To engage, yeah.
Yeah. And with the kind of curiosity that's driven, or rather that's bolstered by, supported by the respect for research. And I'd love to talk more about that with your upcoming show about anthropology. Yeah, your background in anthropology, but because it seems to me you've curated so many interesting thematic and group exhibitions, as well as so many monographic exhibitions. There we go.
Yeah.
Great title too, The Sorcerer's Burden.
Oh, yes. Well, that's me trying to be a little flashy, but it's also connected to, so this is an exhibition that like ties back to my anthropology roots, but I think it's very relevant to our times. I think I'm seeing a lot of intersection. You see a lot of curators doing shows. You see a lot of artists mining anthropology. But for me, it's not about the straightforward stuff, of which there's a lot. And that's important and that's valid. So by straightforward stuff, I mean an artist, a practicing artist going to the Dogon tribe in Africa, filming their cows and coming back and putting that in Documenta. That's a real thing, and it's valid, but that's not this show. This show is about kind of more playful, more subversive, the intersection of fact and fiction, kind of showing how anthropology thinks it's factual, but it's really, it got a lot of fiction, and art claims to be fiction, but it really has a lot of truths to be told, and so what happens in the intersection. And there are also a lot of really fresh emerging artists, so trying to kind of not show the greatest hits, who are also good artists, so people, I guess maybe it doesn't sound nice to name names, but people who are known for doing that, and I have not, those are also great artists, but this show is trying to like uncover a little bit like less beaten path type of artists. And then of course, for me, it brings up a lot of issues around cultural appropriation and colonialism and neo-colonialism and post-colonialism and all of these things about like who has the right to talk about things. Does it make a difference if an artist is is from Africa? Teo Esetu, Ethiopian heritage in the middle. He's done this insanely beautiful moving painting based on La Demoiselle d'Avignon. And basically the conversation is about, I mean, he has live performers that he filmed in the positions of the painting, so it looks like a moving painting. It's incredibly beautiful with a beautiful musical score. It's a new commission. But his comment to me was, well, Picasso took from us, and so now I can take from him and continue the conversation. So it does make a difference between him and, you know, in this case, this is a white, middle-aged female American woman who in her paintings is like ripping from the internet and magazines. And in this case, I mean, it has potential to be an inflammatory painting. This is, these were these comedians in the 80s who dressed in these kind of monkey suits, but that could be seen as kind of a bad stereotype. But I'm
Absolutely.
interested in the issues that these kinds of things bring up. Who does have the right to talk about things, so.
So the ethics of appropriation,
Yeah.
cultural appropriation, the ethics of actually even considering sort of an anthropological approach or methodology in curatorial work is a lot of what you're thinking about, or has been part of the conceptual matrix for the show.
Definitely, and just a lot of the, I don't know, the playful and mischievous and the indirect ways and the poetic ways of talking about it. Let's see. Here's a couple other examples. This is Cameron Jamie, and this is a monkey, Monsinge, and Marie Lorenz, who's doing these kind of water taxi tours, as well as that's a drawing of like an outdoor ancient lobster traps that she's casting and putting in our lake. We are on a lagoon and on a lake, my outdoor sculpture park. I have a museum, it has a downtown building and an outdoor sculpture park, so 2 venues, and the show will be at both venues. But there are no lobsters, obviously. And so it's got this, there's a lot of this like playfulness that I'm imbuing into it, which for me, there is a time and a place for really didactic art, but I have a little bit of exhaustion around that with like only seeing, you know, I think there's like a lot of other ways to talk about things.
Have you always felt that way about didactic art and
No, because like Rodney McMillan can have some strong views, and I loved his work. But I would say, yes, me as a curator, maybe my taste, I like the layers. I like having to, I also really believe in like the profoundness of like what comes after the laugh, what comes after the play, what comes after you kind of like tickle someone's imagination, like how you can kind of come to it on your own rather than having it knocked into your noggin.
Right. And also the selection of artists that you chose, or that we see in the slides, also with my understanding of your exhibition history, you have a real interest and curiosity about artists who also have a background or an interest in science and technology. I was just looking at the Dario Robledo image.
Yes.
That is such a gorgeous portfolio and installation. That I think that image was the first heartbeat.
Yes.
An image of the first heartbeat
You
from the
know that
19th
series?
century. I do.
Yes.
Oh my God.
This
Yeah.
is on the left here.
On the left, right. There's a series of print portfolio that was produced using 19th century. What would you call them?
Oh, I forget the name,
Yeah.
but there was the oldest machine to record a heartbeat consisted of a little delicate thing with a bubble and smoke ash, and it would record either your brain or your heartbeat just by the little movement. So you have to understand that they never heard. It wasn't a recording in the way of the sound. It was a visual recording. So Dario has recreated these images, and they have very poetic underpinnings, sort of like a woman who was pregnant and thinking about her child. What did that heartbeat look like? They have very emotional underpinnings, and it comes from when Dario was 7. I don't know if any of you remember the golden record that got shot up into space. Yes, and at the time, Carl Sagan was going up into space, and Ann Druyan was the director of the NASA project, but a woman, and most often called Carl Sagan's wife. And so there's kind of a like revealing blind spot histories in Dario's work that I love.
Right.
But anyways, Dario, apparently you could call in and hear the record, and he called in and it was some like white noise thing, and it was like so disappointing to him at age 7. But he ended up pursuing this golden record thing, and the story that he stuck on as an adult was that when Anne Druyan was in love with Carl Sagan, she recorded her heart and brain and put that on the record. And so to Dario's mind, it's the first time that love was ever recorded and sent out into space for aliens to hear it. So he has made a whole, like, almost a life's work about this. And so for our show, again, like, what is our purpose as museums? One of our museum's purposes is to commission work and to give artists the opportunity to experiment. So Dario has never formally worked in film and sound, so we've commissioned him what he wanted to do. We'll have those prints, but then he's making the heartbeats come to life with the engineer that he's been collaborating with a visual film that he's also making. So we'll see. I'm excited.
Wow, that sounds amazing. He is in an imaginary checklist I have for a show I want to do about love, of course, because he's done so much work around this.
Could be called Love is the Message.
Love is the message. There we
The
go.
Arthur Jaffa piece. I hope you've all seen that beautiful piece.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, Dario, that is an image of the first, maybe the first heartbeat of an infant, right? And then there is the last heartbeat of a dying person. So the juxtaposition of those two images just struck me incredibly poignant and emotional, right?
Yeah.
But coming back to the way you think about exhibitions, you do have these wonderful ideas that you organize exhibitions around, and we were talking about, having ideas as a curator, when the time comes you're out of ideas, maybe it's the time to move on.
Go be a director.
Yeah, to be a director. But do you have a preference for monographic shows or thematic shows?
No, that's a really good question. So we talked today about all the types of things that we try to go get training and such, and I went to the Getty Leadership Institute last summer, and one of the things that I came out with from my own mind was that we were not doing enough thematic group shows, because that is the opportunity for the museum to have its own intellectual idea, as opposed to monographic shows are wonderful, and like, for example, I'm so proud of this exhibition because next fall I'll be giving this Texas artist her first Texas solo museum show. So that can be very rewarding. But this is not really the museum. If you think about what categorizes an avant-garde program and why a museum is valuable, like what are the reasons? One is giving artists their monographic shows, but another is putting out their own ideas. So the museum having an idea, which an idea that I create for a show is the museum's idea. And I love that you can engage on a scholarly, intellectual level while also being fun and playful. I'm all for accessibility as well. But how do you kind of generate ideas that people can talk about?
Right. I often think of it as like a text, another kind of a text, right?
Yeah.
Often these exhibitions, we are able to produce catalogs, so we literally have text, and we have interpretive text, but as an experiential visual, or text is visual, but kind of a text that you can experience in real time through art is something, it's how I think about exhibition making when I have the chance to do it. And
talk about your philosophy, if you could, behind the thematic versus monographic and what you aspire to. And
well, I am really an exhibition curator. And that's kind of how I was reared, trained in Chicago at MCA. And I've never really had a chance to work with a collection in a serious way until I moved to Atlanta. So, and we have a wonderful collection here, and I'm proud to have grown that collection and worked with the collection to help to prompt exhibition proposals here that are complementary. But for for me, exhibitions are the most exciting kinds of exhibitions for me to think about are thematic exhibitions. And personally, I like big ideas because there is room to for diversity in terms of artistic approaches, media, other artists or people who we may not describe or think about artists, think of as artists rather, but who have an approach to their practice that is interesting, innovative, that is poetic, and a group exhibition or a thematic exhibition that is around a big idea allows that space for me to be an author, you know, in that way, and also to be a little bit, this may be provocative, as a little bit of an artist, to kind of enjoy that moment of being an artist. Maybe that for me happens more often when I'm installing art, because we can make decisions that are aesthetic and that have real physical, tangible effects.
Yeah. No, you're right about the most creative parts of our job are, you know, if you're working with the artist to create their own work, that's intimate and creative in a sense, but our creativity, I think, comes from books and installing and the way that you curate, and then the thematic ideas. So yeah, those are the most creative parts of our job.
Yeah.
Very fulfilling.
And monographic shows are fantastic. Most of the shows that I've done at the High Museum, I had to think, have been monographic. And I think they're for most museums across the country, monographic shows has been the trend, right? Thematic exhibitions are costly. There's a lot of research and travel that is required to do it right. And there are all the logistical costs of shipping, crating, of consolidating materials here and bringing it to your site.
Bring the artists for install. I
Bring
have
the
like 8 artists out of 11 coming, so that's it adds up.
From Kenya, from Shanghai, you know, wherever they're based, and yeah, it adds up. So they're expensive, but I think they have an impact in the world, within our communities, that is profound, and I'm not sure that museums have been able to measure the value of these kinds of exhibitions, which are really like thought pieces. They're big thought pieces that allow that space for our audience also to think and to imagine and to expand upon their understanding of ideas, issues that are urgent, perhaps, or relevant to their own situations.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
We were talking earlier, Heather and I, about, again, coming back to artists who live and work in our cities. And I love how you described how you have integrated artists into exhibitions rather than creating like a regional gallery or a regional project. Instead, respecting the artists in your community and including them in exhibitions alongside others.
Yeah, so my museum, the mission is to reflect the spectrum of contemporary art, but when I came there with my boss from the Albright Knox almost 7 years ago, it was really meant to elevate the program and show global art, bring international art. It wasn't not meant to be emerging, and we could look at Strange Pilgrims. Oh yeah.
There we go.
Oop.
A little slow. Do I keep going?
I think it's after that. One more.
Come on. Okay,
There we go.
There we go.
So I was asked sort of like, how do I integrate artists from the region into my program, which we don't have a lot of turnovers. I mean, you know, we do basically at this point 2 or 3 seasons a year, and we're at 2 at this point, and so that's at the most, if you use both floors, you know, 4 shows. So there's not a lot, and we have our sculpture park. So when I do these big thematic shows, and it will only be my second coming up this September, what I said was, well, with the program we have, with the mission that we have, the best way that I think to include artists from the region is to treat them as I would every other artist in the world, which is like, so, you know, this exhibition, Strange Pilgrims, which was about experiential art, and it was named for a Borges selection of short stories about travel and nomadicness and getting out of your head and that sort of thing, inspired by Austin's experientialness of live music and all that other stuff, but also the kind of global art trend towards, you know, more experiential art. What was to include really important international artists that many know, such as Bruce Nauman. I'm not sure if you know Charles Atlas, but he's, in my mind, an icon. And Mexico City is, I think, one of the most important contemporary art centers in the world. And so that's a Sofia Taboas. But then amidst that, all on the same playing field, it was both Austin artists and an artist that I loved from Buffalo, which is where I came before. So Millie Chen was from Buffalo. Andy is in Austin. Algebert is in Houston. And Lakes Were Rivers was a collective in Austin. And to prepare for this show, just like with other exhibitions that I do, as you said, I traveled all over Texas. I got recommendations from tons of curators and artists. I would stay a weekend in a city and make 10 or 12 studio visits. And I found Angelbert. He had never had a museum show, to my mind, at all, I think. That could be wrong, but definitely not in Texas. And he got 5 exhibitions after this, I mean, like all in a row. He got all these exhibitions because his work was amazing. And he was just hiding out in his, in his studio. And this was actually, I got him to bring an installation from his house, the lived experience of that studio visit. He brought it into the exhibition space. But the artists are there, and there are wonderful artists in your state and in your city. And again, it's about taking the time to look and just engage, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But to me, this is my favorite way to work with whatever you might say is a local artist, but you could also just say an artist who happens to live in your town, is to put them on the same level as a Bruce Nauman. Or there was Yoko Ono in this show. Yoko Ono was installed across from Lakes Were Rivers. So to me, that creates the right kind of level playing field.
Yeah.
And also, for me, like, how can you benefit artists? I don't know that all artists in Austin or in Atlanta feel this way. I'm sure some don't. But what happens then, too, is then around the openings, there's a whole energy, and there's all these visiting gallerists, and they all see, there's so much more visibility. Now, what happens is, if you don't do, like, let's say a local project series, less people are able to get into the shows.
To participate, yeah.
That's the trade-off. And so I'm sure Andy and Angelbert and Lakes Were Rivers were very happy, but was it at the expense of other artists who felt like if you could have included more people in a biennial type show? But it's just not, I think it's more valuable this way.
Yeah, I agree. And thinking about thematic or group exhibitions, thematic exhibitions allows that space for you as the curator or the author to include artists like Angelbert in an exhibition alongside Yoko Ono and other people, and allow them that stage for their work to actually have the kind of respect that maybe it wouldn't receive, maybe not immediately in its hometown. I see that often where artists who live and work in a place persevere, and they work so hard,
they never break through.
They're perceived as local artists in the pejorative sense, right? I think being local is, I'm proud to be local. I like it. But you know what I mean? And then I'm so happy when I see artists in this city and the other places I've lived who have been able to have the opportunity to show outside of Honolulu or outside of Chicago or outside of Atlanta, and they prosper, they find a voice. It's like coming to voice in a way, to borrow an expression from bell hooks, you know, as an artist, because they have that kind of affirmation and are given that kind of respect on a stage where their work can stand alongside Bruce Nauman or somebody. It's so important.
Yeah.
It's like what we did. I think we did that tried to do that in Chicago when I say we, the curatorial staff, founded 12 by 12. We did that for emerging artists, and you're absolutely right. We had a whole debate about whether that was going to be. That doesn't mean we're only thinking about young people, but artists who are just emerging in their practice, and that person philosophically could have been 70 years old. Anyway, that was a program for emerging artists. At the same time, we were very intentional about visiting with mid-career artists who are teaching, at Northwestern, at UIC, and including them in group exhibitions when we could, and on occasion doing monographic exhibitions, like solo exhibitions of artists. Of course, Carrie James is perhaps the most prominent example of that, with now 2 solo exhibitions at MCA.
Yeah.
But that was really intentional, because there was this divide between the local community, artist community, and the museum. And I think it was a successful approach. And it was successful for us, too, not only for the museum and its reputation, but as a curatorial staff, for us to recognize the kind of value that we can add, that we can bring to the context of the creative community in our city.
Yeah, and I think you probably do this as well. You're 2 programmers who are fantastic and helped organize this evening. We do a lot of additional ways of connecting through programming, through public programming. So like our museum also does something called Crit Group, which is a whole semester. You apply to get in, and you have 2 kind of really knowledgeable people leading it in the museum. It's hosted by the museum. It's a Crit Group where you develop your art and your ideas, and then our museum, we organize an exhibition of their work. We also do Art 101, where we bring people in to talk about art. So I think we try through a lot of programming as well, because I feel limited in what I can do with exhibitions, and I think as a mission of the museum, we try to do it in a lot of different ways. The other thing we talked about was I have a philosophy that any time anyone asks me in Austin, which is sometimes a difficult thing to fulfill, but anytime anyone asks me in Austin to either make a studio visit or to do a talk or to do whatever, I will do it. So, and we talked about, like, normally we feel at this point we should be paid for things, but like doing a talk or or participating in a class, but for my community, it just feels, for better and for worse, like I'll just do anything that. If an artist ever asks me to come visit, I will come visit. It's about that, like, can you at least honor people with, that I will look at your work, and everybody should have that. And so, time-wise, it can be tough, but I've sort of established an informal program at my department, which my director was very supportive of, where we would take, work time, and what I would do is set up, we do this maybe like at least once a month, where we take a half a day and we set up a whole bunch of visits, and my whole department goes, and we go to the artist-run spaces, we meet the artists who are doing the show, they talk to us for 40 minutes, we go to the next place, so kind of like museum-supported going and spending time with. I think, we don't really we see most shows that way. So that's a more informal gesture, but just taking the time to.
Yeah, it's really hard. It comes back to the your other title, manager of expectations, right?
Yeah.
That and finding a way to reach audience in the place you live, through programs, through other ways, through other channels, because there are only so many opportunities for exhibitions, and acquisitions are even more limited. And I think that's what a wonderful approach. I have Thursdays blocked off for studio visits. I have for
Really?
years, but I have to say I haven't been good at it lately because our calendars get so full.
So
I won't
jammed.
make complain and make excuses, but you know, right? Time is so
Yeah, and travel,
dear,
and then you're
travel.
gone.
Yeah, yeah. So, but it's still on the calendar because that's really important. And when I can, I do as well go out and visit with artists in their studios or go to exhibitions that are on view in galleries and around town or other alternative spaces. But I like to do more. So it's like that. I don't know if you feel the same way, but I have this horrible feeling of pressure and guilt that, oh, I can't be there tomorrow night for this opening because I'm going to be on my way to see my partner in Chicago. And
Yeah.
it always seems to be like the shows that are open are always on that day that I'm on my way somewhere. But I try to get to anyway,
Oh, yeah.
TMI, I know. But I try to get to the shows, but I like to be there with community to celebrate and to, have the kinds of conversations otherwise you may never have.
Yeah. No, I have the same issue between that and leaving my cats at home for too many days, TMI. Childless curators, we worry about our cats, okay? Yeah, I have a lot of guilt about it, but here's how I mediate that guilt, is that I don't like guilt. I think it's a very useless and negative emotion.
Right.
So what I do is, because I'm also away a lot, and weekends, it's like, what Saturday night I would like to think that I have other lives, other things going on, and I do. And so that time that I spend where we set up the visits during the day, what I always think about is that's more valuable, I think, to us and to the artist. The parties are fun, but I think it's doing my job by going and taking the time and talking to them. So that's how I get my head out of not going to the openings, because I'm not around as much.
Yeah, and there's other things that we do. I'm sure you do as much as I do. Recommendations, writing recommendations, whether it's for graduate school or for grants or for other programs like the Tiffany Foundation, for example.
Oh, yeah.
Recommending artists to these granting
Absolutely.
organizations or prizes.
It's like the behind-the-scenes thing.
No one knows that we do
No one
that,
knows,
right?
yeah.
Except the artists who might ask us for recommendation. And all of that stuff, I try to do I do all of that. I never say no.
Absolutely.
I shouldn't say that. I do say no. I don't say no.
Yeah. Yeah.
But because I believe it's really important for us. We're in a position to make a difference, and for artists whom we believe, in whose work we believe, it's I think one of my responsibilities to take that time to make the recommendation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's our chance to have a little impact on the artist. So.
Or share contact information or recommendations with other colleagues, right? We have a lot of curators coming to Atlanta now, which is fantastic. When I came here, I didn't see that as much, but we have curators from around the country coming to Atlanta, and they often come to me and Daniel at the Contemporary, Atlanta Contemporary, and a few others, and ask for recommendations. And we're delighted to provide recommendations for artists who could use the input. Everyone could use the input of a fresh perspective, and also to have that kind of visibility from curators who represent institutions around the country. That's really super important. I think that's helped, not what I've done, but collectively in the city. I think it's helped to raise the profile of our visual arts community in the city.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, be mindful of the time. We're going to open it up for you guys to ask questions, but I wanted to ask one thing. I wanted to ask you, Heather, because you've worked in 3 institutions with great collections. MCA has a great collection, but the 2 other museums, the Carnegie and Albright Knox, have phenomenal collections. So you're now working at an institution. You collect, right?
We only collect outdoor sculpture.
So public sculpture.
No indoor. So the indoor is a Kunsthalle. We actually gifted our collection to the Blanton.
Right.
And then now we don't collect indoor and we collect outdoor sculpture, but not quickly. I mean, the space is filling up, so.
Yeah. Well, you had some great insights, some wonderful insights about working with the collection, especially such amazing collections with spectacular examples. I mean, like iconographic works. And now working in essentially a Kunsthalle.
Mm-hmm.
How would you describe the sort of virtues and I don't want to say vices. What's the opposite of virtues? The great things about working with a collection and the great things about working with
I think we're
artists.
supposed to call the difficult things challenges. And not problems, right?
Thank you. Right.
So first of all, I would just say you should know how lucky you are to have Michael here. He did such a beautiful rehang of the collection. I was so blown away. And you have made such important gestures towards, reflecting the people who live in Atlanta and responding to what people want to see and uncovering blind spots in like age-old canons. And like, it's so wonderful what you've done here. So the answer is I miss working with a great collection. I didn't think I would feel that way, but it's also just like when you do a lot of one thing, then you miss kind of the other thing. And I've had a lot of different kinds of museum experience. So I think I was saying at the Carnegie, we had, major installations and commissions for the Carnegie International. I was the assistant curator, and I thought, oh gosh, I just love working with artists, and I'm very empathetic, and I was an artist, so I have an artist brain, and I think they're crazy and wild and fun and all of that stuff, and now I'm way more jaded, by the way. But then I went to the Albright Knox, and it was it has one of the most incredible collections, and I did a lot of collection shows, plus a couple of major exhibitions that, like Wish You Were Here and the Robert Therian show. But I remember sometimes working with artists, but wishing more of it. And when I went to the Austin with my boss from the Albright Knox, I thought, oh yes, I'm gonna be all like new commissions and working with artists, and that's mostly what I'm doing. And then after about 7 years, I miss working with the collection sometimes. And there's just something so wonderful about like the nerdiness of like being behind the scenes and digging up things that can only speak to you quietly and through your own research, and like thinking about things like what's left out, and there's no one talking to you about that. It's like you're looking and you're thinking, and also seeing the wonderful history of what people before you have collected and how that reflects things. And like when you gave me the tour today talking about this has never been shown, or this wasn't shown for 30 years, or like that's amazing. And the Menil, which we were also talking about, a wonderful museum in Texas, that for the first time when they reopened their building, they installed only collection. Only collection. And it was the first time I understood from the director, the first time they've ever done only the collection. It's like, guess what? You have an amazing collection, and doesn't always need to be borrowed shows, or doesn't always need to be new commissions. So yeah, so I have collection envy, if I'm being honest. But grass is always greener.
Grass is always greener, right? But we learn from these two different kinds of experiences, because I always felt a little out of fish out of water, at least in the first year or two here, because I really thought of myself as an exhibition curator. That's how I approached what I did. And so because opportunities are limited to do exhibitions, I found opportunity in the collection, and mining the collection, and researching the collection, and discovering. I like you described them as blind spots rather than gaps, because there's always a gap in a collection. There's gaps, like a sieve. But for me and for my colleagues here, what was interesting and sometimes exciting, sometimes troubling, was to discover those blind spots and to see what the museum has done so well for the last 10 years, and what maybe prior to that, prior to the 2000s, was sort of a lack of awareness of the direction the collection was taking, at least in terms of my collection, which was predominantly white men. And there were moments that I've discovered through researching the history of the collection, where we had these years of great vitality and growth when it came to women in the collection, artists of color. There were, these moments, these spurts in the 80s, actually late 70s, and then 80s, and then more recently, since I've joined the museum, in the last 10 years, we've seen a great deal of growth in that area. But also, that just, I think for me and for my colleagues, that allows us to do a reset, to reset our priorities, and to think about the collection holistically in relationship to our audience and to the people we serve. And in my opinion, the people we serve are the people who live in this city, in this metro area. And then, of course, all the visitors from, like yourself and others, who come to our museum to, often people who come from outside, they want to see something that's unique about the city, right?
Yes. Well, and it all gets back to like something you were talking about with curating, that we're storytellers, basically.
Yeah.
So we're telling stories, and I feel mostly respectful also of the stuff that happened in the past when people like curators were doing their best and directors were doing their best and collecting what they thought was important. It was of that moment, right. And we can be respectful of that while still rewriting that. I mean, we have a lot of this in Texas with the Confederate monuments and things like that, or things that are, it's happening all over, isn't it? But things that were of an era, and we now know that they don't really fit how we think now, and so we don't need to erase them, but we can rewrite them and recontextualize them and move them to proper places and things like that. And so it's like with your collection development that you've been doing, with your kind of beautiful progress towards these things that you've been talking about, and your rehanging of the collection, you can just, you're not erasing, you're shifting. The path is going like this way now with your direction.
Yeah, and that's what I meant when I said exciting. It's obviously not exciting to see, to understand that we need to do better in certain areas, but the opportunity to do that is there. The opportunity to rewrite histories, to reconstruct histories, to deconstruct histories, and to introduce new narratives that are crisscrossing, that are parallel, to enrich our understanding of what we do and the value we bring to our audience. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Heather, thank you. Is this a good time to?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, we're going to open it up to questions, and we have a question near the front row. I'm going to give it to you, Erin.
Now we have to share our microphone.
Curators don't share well, so.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. My name is Shady. I'm a local. Question about the archive. Like, what's your relationship with the archive, especially coming from talking about the collection? Do you think about it in terms of a collection, or do you rely on an archivist? Is it just a methodology to you? Okay, yeah, I know that's a lot, but I'm trying to give you a lot of access points. Is it, we're just thinking a lot about the archive these days. We're using it on Instagram where we're archiving, photographs. We're using it in our daily work, talking about archiving something as a verb. So I just wanted to know what your relationship was with the archive. For both of you, like anthropologically or, in terms of collecting.
Our archives at the High Museum really consist of the object files that relate to each of the artworks in the collection, and all of the artworks that have been in the collection that are no longer part of our collection, because a part of a museum collection often includes deaccessioning, so things are not permanently, in a collection. The idea of a permanent collection is not really true to the extent that there are things that, have a life in an institution. Anyway, I'm getting in the weeds. So those paper files for me are fascinating, and they're so valuable because you can trace the history of ownership and production of an artwork through primary resource materials, artist letters, their instructions, documents, photographs, other kinds of documents. And for me, that helps to construct a history of the institution, which has been eye-opening for not only me, but my other colleagues in doing this exercise of the reinstallation. So that archive is essential for us to get our head wrapped around where we're at right now and how we got here. Other aspects of archives are important to me in my early interest in becoming a librarian. So I was going to be a librarian. This is an accidental career for me. So I respect archives so profoundly because they allow me the space and the materials to do the kind of research and deep thinking that often gets cut out of my time budget with my job now. Anyway.
The short answer is I love archives. I find them immeasurably important, and I do not get to work with them enough at my current museum. I'll just briefly go back towards this one was like the biggest archival, amazing 4 years of my life, because so much of this show was about me digging through archives. It was a show that I thought of because of Tony Conrad being in Buffalo, and it unraveled into this massive project and exhibition that was like a PhD. It had took me 4 years, and it had about 400 objects, but half of those were archival things. So, I mean, archives are like the living, unbelievable stories that you can discover if you take the time. I'll just give you one example. This Paul Scherritz, right, was like through researching in the archives of the Albright Knox, I discovered that the curator Linda Cathcart gave the filmmaker Paul Scherritz his first museum show, and it was this piece, Dream Displacement, which had never been seen since 1976. I went, I found the newspaper articles, I found the documents from the show. It was collecting dust in anthology film archives that had never been preserved. So I raised $25,000, paid for the preservation of the piece. In the process of making this piece, where, you know, if you know structuralist filmmaker geeks, they are very territorial and they're super smart, and like they will tell you like you don't know what you're talking about if you're just like a regular curator. Well, I had done so much archival research that I discovered that this piece had quadraphonic sound because of the press article that I found that came out in 1976 that said it had that. And they were not going to do sound when we were preserving it. And I said, look, I have this article. And they were like, oh, yeah, okay. And so to me, I uncovered so many fabulous stories. I included a lot of letters in this show, like Bruce Naumann's first exhibition at the museum had hate mail, you know, and then like the curator sent him this letter saying, I'm so sorry that everyone hated your show. And I loved putting that letter out because this show came out like right after he was like the Venice Pavilion. And I thought, oh my God, that's amazing. I found another letter where Robert Longo begged a Buffalo collector to buy both pieces of a diptych, and she didn't. And what I did for the show was I found that piece and I put the pieces together for the first time since they were made. And he came to the opening, Robert Longo, and begged her to buy the piece back. With this letter in front of him. So to me, the archive is like this beating heart of so much information. I worry about it too with the digital age because I'm terrible at archiving my emails, and nobody writes you love letters anymore. No curator gets hate mail. I mean, I don't get those letters anymore. So I feel like those are amazing moments that I'm very, very worried are being lost because of digital, but that makes me sound old.
I'm interested if you could talk about what the collaboration as a curator between the artists and how far you go between becoming the artist yourself. And, you know, I think that's there's some ethical kind of dialogues in there.
I have been told, for better or for worse, I have a very light touch as a curator. And sometimes this means that I let the artist run wild or don't tell them what I think they should be doing ever. I always thought that was really, I just also as a person hate to really tell people what to do. It's not that I'm not thinking it or not that I'm not mad that you're not doing it, but I really like to not have a heavy hand. I don't like the idea of a curator being a frustrated artist. I think the creativity, I mean, I was an artist. I don't want to be an artist, but I love the creativity of what the curatorial field in that when we talked about coming up with the ideas. I mean, just choosing the artist is creative. Saying that I'm going to give Deborah Roberts a show because I think it's really important, that feels very creative to me and very like, editing and choosing but you know, and I'll help her. It's more, I think more when I'm invited in by the artists, you know, so like I did a show with Wagechi Mutu and I remember I was like, told her one piece I wanted in the show and then I sort of let her, and then it was during install, she said, I would really like your input. And then that made me feel, okay, good, like I have some opinions. I tend to have a pretty light touch and I know that there's every shade of gray. And there was a curator who I won't say at the MCA who was known for just being like, this is what I want, this is what you have to do, or like, get out of my show type of thing. He was very respected too, but it's just a different style. So I love the collaboration in terms of talking about what the ideas are, but like my response, if they were like, what should I do? I would be like, what do you think you should do? And kind of like having a conversation about it rather than telling them what to do. And maybe that has to do with how I like to be approached as well. It could be very narcissistic and selfish, but for me it works. Sometimes I look back and think maybe I should have had a little bit of a heavier hand and curbed something, but I don't really have any regrets about it, so.
Yeah, I think that comes from having great respect for what artists do, right? And respecting their intentionality. And before you even get to that point where you're working with an artist in an exhibition or a commission, you've already done the groundwork. You've done studio visits. You know what their project is all about. And so you have the confidence to give them that space, right? And I feel like I have a light touch too, in that I feel a measure of joy providing that space for an artist to just kind of, you know, do their thing. And I mentioned earlier in organizing exhibitions that it was a moment for me to feel like an artist. I didn't really mean that in that way. In installing exhibitions, it gives us the opportunity to be creative in terms of juxtapositions and creating a conversation between objects, and to think about how people can experience, our audience can experience an exhibition. And that's, for me, maybe as creative as I can get in terms of, you know, designing a space and making these kinds of juxtapositions. But really, I think, comes out of this profound respect for what artists do and giving them that room.
Take one more. Yeah, okay.
I'm afraid mine isn't an interesting question, but it's just a procedural one, which is, Michael, for a Thursday studio visit, do you prefer to be contacted by letter, postcard, email, or phone call?
I prefer emails. I've become a phonophobe in this new age, so because I'm getting all of these weird phone calls from, they're not from people, they're from machines. And so I on my cell phone, on my work phone, so it's strange. I think we're going to live in a culture soon where we don't use the telephone to communicate anymore. Yeah. So I prefer emails, and that's a good introduction. And then, you know, I typically look at artists' work and make that connection initially and get to know their work remotely first. Any other questions? Tony?
In terms of studio visits, I've been noticing some of the websites or some apps have these 360-degree studio tours. Is that something that you have experienced where you're engaging with a studio visit virtually?
No, I don't know about that.
No, I've been seeing, it's
No, I
sort of
haven't
a
seen
trend that's been going on. It's like they do it for galleries where you'll
Right.
go this way and you get
Yeah,
closer. then
almost
back.
like real estate. Is that what
Right,
you mean?
right,
Like you're
right.
looking at an apartment, it's
Exactly.
360? Yeah, I can't imagine a worse way to experience a studio, right?
I'll just give a short answer. The name of my essay in my book coming out is Being There, which is from Bronislaw Malinowski, the anthropologist who kind of pioneered field work in situ. So I'll just say nothing can replace being there.
Exactly. Okay. Touche.
That's a great place to end it. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Aaron and Yema, thank you.